Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another Northshire Presents virtual event. My name is David Wood. I'm the events manager at Northshire's Manchester, Vermont location. I'm here, as so often, with my good friend Rachel Person from Northshire's Saratoga Springs location. And we've got a great event ready for you. We are so excited about this. We've been looking forward to this, and Rachel and I have been really pumped about this one. But before we get started, I'll hand things over to her in just a minute to introduce our authors. But just a few notes. We are recording tonight's event for later broadcast on our YouTube channel, but only those of us who are unmuted and in this nice little yellow box will be showing up there in perpetuity. So if at any point in the night you have a question for our authors, please type them in the chat box. Rachel and I will save them up and then ask them at the Q&A at the end. And we'll post them for you. And finally, it has been a year, as you know, a year or plus, and it's continuing on like that. We've heard that there are supply chain issues everywhere, so we are recommending that everyone do their shopping for the holidays early and shop local, of course. So if you are interested in that book, if you're ordering a book like that, you should order them right away, because we've heard from publishers that they might be out, and when they're out, they might be gone. Without further ado, let me hand things over to Rachel.
All of us at Northshire are delighted to be partnering with our great friends at Yaddo to present this evening's event. For anyone who isn't familiar with it, Yaddo is a legendary artist retreat here in Saratoga Springs and a vital part of both the local and the global artistic communities. The Yaddo Presents events at Northshire have been part of a partnership that goes back many years now, highlighting the work of Yaddo artists in the bookstore in non-COVID times, and now wonderfully virtually. So thank you, Yaddo, for your support of this event. Tonight, I am so thrilled to get to welcome Amitava Kumar. He has joined us tonight to talk about his new novel, A Time Outside This Time. He visited both Northshire locations upon the publication of his previous novel, the bookseller favorite, Immigrant Montana, and he's written several other works of fiction and nonfiction and teaches at Vassar College. He'll be interviewed tonight by another writer I've long admired, Jenny Offill. I was lucky to host Jenny in our Saratoga store for her novels Department of Speculation and Weather. The event for Weather we were just talking about was one of our last truly normal in-store events. So it's really a thrill to see both of them here on our computer screens tonight. Please join me in welcoming them both to Northshire Presents. And Amitava, why don't you kick things off with a short reading from the book?
All right. Hi, guys. While that introduction was being made by our friends, I was looking for a section which I stole from Jenny's book, because I thought that would be the right way of starting off the conversation. Jenny had quoted this wonderful Yale historian whose work is on the rise of fascism in Europe, Timothy Snyder. And the book was this small book, which I think once Jenny, it's called On Tyranny. And Jenny had told me that she sometimes just puts copies of the books here and there. And that's a wonderful idea. And I think it's a wonder. The book recommends various things we should do at the very small level of normal interaction with each other that allows us to, in some ways, counteract fascism. I was very eager to find that, so that before any reviewer said, it's really shameful that Amitava Kumar has just stolen things from Jenny Offill, and then had the audacity to ask her for a blurb and put it right there on the back cover. I just thought I should make those things clear. But nevertheless, here's a little section from near the beginning of the book. When I was a boy in my hometown, and it had been raining for 3 days, it became so that it was no longer possible to have any consciousness of a time when it wasn't raining. Rain soaked through the walls, and slime grew on the inside, in the corners, and even on the ceiling. Phones stopped working. No newspapers came. Birds disappeared from the wet branches of trees. No question of going to school. There was no language. Outside, it is raining outside. Water stood in the distant fields. It rushed down pipes and roared in the gutters. The roads became rivers in which people waded or swam. Brij Bihari brought his cows onto the veranda at the back of our house. Mother would switch on the fans in one room to try to dry the wet clothes. It was all in vain. The snake found in the toilet was proof that the world outside had changed. and the natural order had been turned upside down. Only rain was permanent. You could do nothing but wait. I'm saying all this because that is exactly what has happened to us politically. We cannot imagine, I cannot imagine sometimes, a time outside this time. The people who are in power must also be deluded enough to believe this. They must think that their power is eternal, that they will sit on the throne forever. And it is this thought that is their failing, because it condemns them to missteps and error. Stay alert. You will hear the rain stop and the wind shift. The powerful will not be waiting for it, but that moment will come. It will mark the beginning of their doom, their end. Thank you.
I'm so glad you read that section. That's one of my favorite parts of the book. I just love that idea of there not being any way to think of the time before the rain. Because I feel like one of the things that's so interesting in your novel is, I mean, in the title alone, A Time Outside This Time, it suggests that it was not always thus.
Yes. Yes.
But we have gotten used to sometimes a steady drip of bad news, sometimes a fire hose of
Yes.
bad news. And I wanted to just talk to you about where your starting point was for that, because in this section that you read, you know, the book begins with this writer who's at an artist colony, and he's out in this beautiful space, and he's using it as a moment to sort of think back to what appear to be his own childhood memories. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, like, where was your starting point for the book? Had you written that at the beginning, or did you move it later?
What happened was that Trump, just before Trump was elected, so I'm talking about 2016, towards the end of 2016, I was driving down after giving a talk at the Hartwick College, which is in Oneonta. And it was the first anniversary of the rather, I would say inaugural is the wrong word, but it was in a spate of lynchings of Muslim men in India.
Mm-hmm.
It was the first anniversary. So I was driving. It's a bad thing, you know, everyone should not try this in their cars, but I wrote one line, you know, on a little notebook. And then I stopped the car to write a bit more. It was called A Man is Being Killed. And I put that in the beginning of the book, but then my editor has moved it right towards the end. Mm-hmm. So that was the starting point. And then, coincidentally, just like my narrator, I too happened to read in the New York Times Obama's interview with Michiko Kakutani, where he said that Malia Obama had been reading Hemingway, and he had read this, and she had read this line, "Write the truest sentence you know," from Hemingway. And I thought, you know what? Let's flip it. Every day, because this guy was lying through his teeth, let me write down one revealing lie. So that was the starting point, really. You know, the days started, these were days of such despair, you'll remember. So I just thought, just let me remember the lies he is saying each day, you know?
Mm-hmm. Because it would be it would be hard to remember even just a few months later. I remember thinking for a while with Trump's press secretary, the first one, Sean Spicer, and I would be so amazed how he seemed to, as he seemed like a hostage who was having a gun held to his head as he would read out these various lies, or the little ways that they would try not to mention Jewish people when they talked about Holocaust Remembrance Day. All the sort of first like signs that not only was it going to be as bad as we thought, but it was probably going to be quite a bit worse.
Yes.
Now, there were certain people who knew that from the beginning, perhaps people that had always been very aware of these dark currents. But I feel like that Hemingway quote has paralyzed, generations of writers. I know I've sat at my computer and been like, one true sentence. So I love the reversal of that.
Yeah.
Because I feel like it is, I know sometimes as a writer, I'll be thinking to myself, what is writing fiction gonna do? What does it mean to be approaching these different things through fiction? And so did you feel like you were going to be asking yourself, like, what's the difference between fake news and fiction from the beginning? Because it was funny, when I was reading your book, I kept noticing, oh, there's so many questions that are asked in the book. I could just like make the whole, my whole interview could be from like excellent questions that are in the book, because you begin with what is the opposite of a rumor?
Yes.
Later you go on to say, if we look at a story, it ought to be surrounded with other questions. Whose story is it? What ends does it serve? Does it affirm or contradict other stories?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm curious if those are questions that just the narrator is asking, or if you were also, as a writer, grappling.
It so happens that many of the narrator's questions appealed to me very much. So, for example, I don't know who got it first, my narrator did or I did, but this question, who among your neighbors will look the other way
Mm-hmm.
when a figure of authority comes to your door and puts a boot in your face? I don't know who got the question first, but I certainly remember that this was there from the beginning in this enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
I was just telling someone else the other day that, there isn't anything. I mean, I liked Claudia Rankine's work on the killing of Black people, but I also liked in the book Citizen, for example, there's a photograph and you see people milling around in hats and Sunday clothes, it seems. It's night, and they're pointing like this. And that's all that the picture is. What has been cut out is the lynched body of the Black male that these people have come to celebrate. So how to both notice the violence, but also erase something that has so far served voyeuristic purpose, etc., and then thereby heighten our own response to atrocity. Those were the sorts of questions that I really had at my heart, And in terms of the first question that you started with, how that was gripping you also about status of fiction, I thought, how do I approach the idea of uncovering something that the state has said and then reveal something else, so that we do not always accept the state's story?
And the main character is reading 1984, also while he's away on this fellowship. And as I'm sure many of you know, there was a huge resurgence. That book suddenly went to the bestseller list. I remember suddenly seeing all sorts of people with it and being a little surprised, but it was one of those things where I think it wasn't so much about what we used to think about 1984, like surveillance, because actually it turned out the surveillance is what we all just allowed to happen.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Like no one needed Big Brother. We all just like our phones.
Yeah.
But the part where the words were being used to mean the opposite of what we think they mean, and that sort of perversion of language, I feel like that is something that that the writer in the book is really interested in. Like, what does it mean once, I'm writing in language. I believe that language can have truth in it, but also where is the part where we kind of come up against words not telling us enough? And I think this idea of like us being numbed, I know the scholar Robert J. Lifton, who studied about sort of people's reaction to the atomic bomb. And he talked about the danger of psychic numbing, that at a certain point, something is too much and we just shut it out. And I was thinking about that a lot with this character, because I feel like one of the things that Satya does is he goes again and again towards something.
Yeah.
He doesn't keep looking away. In fact, when he flinches, he asks himself, why am I flinching? Why am I not looking?
Yes. I know that Jonathan Franzen gets a lot of bad press.
Not anymore. There's a resurgence.
Oh.
Everyone likes him now.
Oh, okay. But one thing I really liked in one of the, he did the best American essays maybe in 2016 or something. He was the editor, and he wrote there that like firefighters, writers are the ones who run towards the fire while everyone else is fleeing.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that my own partiality for putting journalists in my books is precisely to think a little bit about, in a very obvious way, I think, and I'm a little bit conscious of how unimaginative I am, of having the journalist pursue a certain idea. You know what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
And I must say that, on one hand, what was the name of, you mentioned Sean Spicer, but Kellyanne Conway was her name. What was the name of the woman? Her use of the word alternative facts, for example, was right out of the Orwellian dictionary.
Yes.
But as much as the perversion of language, I am really struck, if you think about the global pandemic of populism, I'm really struck by how people I went to school with or people in my own family think of this murderous thug called Modi as really a father figure or a savior, and they always refer with the honorific G at the end of the name. And that is not just about language. It is just about a wholesale surrender to a populist ideology driven by a demagogue. And I think that all those folks who think of the West as being different from those backward, darker nations make a mistake in thinking, because these folks are, you folks are as susceptible and have been equally surrendering to the demagoguery of someone like Trump, So it's and that worries me more. I mean, maybe what do you think? As a writer, one should worry about language, of course, but what about,
Yeah, I mean, I think, the reason I quoted Timothy Snyder in my novel was that I became quite a fascism doomer for a while before this election, and it didn't completely go away, but I felt like, one of the things that I think is sort of hard for people to recognize who don't study propaganda is that repetition just sounds like truth to people. And so we never quite knew what would have happened if, like, the lie about the birther stuff with Obama, if social media had been at the level that it is now, that could have been enough to mean that he was not elected president. And I think also the sense of like things happening globally.
Yes.
And the idea that, like, no, it's not just in this part of the world, and that American exceptionalism, which we always like to have, even though at this point you would think it had been knocked down by every actual historical thing. But so I think that one of the things that I liked about the reporter, that he's a novelist, but he's also a reporter, is that it allowed this character to go into this kind of investigative mode, because there's a quite long section that's really interesting about a man from Pakistan who Khalid, am I saying his name right?
Khalid, yeah.
And the questions of, like, is the story he's telling, how do I verify it, and what level of state interference was there with him, and what does all that mean? And so I felt like when the character switches from the kind of novelist hat to the investigative journalist hat, it also provides this really nice change in just the kind of language and tone of the prose.
Yeah. One of the things that attracts me about that move, frankly, is that for a long time I have been a practicing academic, and some of my best friends are academics, and it is you want to get away from the certitudes that are attained in the comfort of the seminar room through a real encounter with the complexities of a contradictory world that we inhabit, and going out and meeting people. And so that was also a part of what I was doing in those chapters, trying through specific interactions in the world, going, for example, to, I don't know, a police camp to fight left-wing guerrilla movements in India, just trying to get a sense of what are, at the very micro level, how are people operating, etc. But I have a question about that, because many people here must be here to listen to you, Jenny, too. So tell me. Oh, yes, I found the part in your book, at least, where you quote Timothy Snyder. And I'm slightly bit appalled to think that I've just lifted that section into my book.
Amitava speaking about his book.
What happened? I don't even know whether there was some other section, but what I wanted to ask you, Jenny, was that one thing that in your writing is so attractive.
Breaking the rules. He's breaking the rules.
No. Because I really want to learn, and I think everyone else will appreciate this. Those excursions into the outer world that my narrator does, going to another, let's say to a camp, and then writing about meeting a police informant who was, those are about 12, 13,000 words long. Mm-hmm. And I love the fleet-footedness of your prose when you break it into smaller sections. So on one hand, the idea of doing what seems like a long-form nonfiction, what they call in the New Yorker, that length is attractive. How about, what do you gain? And how should one break the mold of that, let me stretch it out over 13,000 words or something, and instead do something that is a little quicker? How do you train yourself to take things out?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting though, because in this novel, one of the things that you're talking about is that the news comes at us so quickly. In fact, you have a whole chapter, A Velocity of Lies, which is just news stories. And I think that there's this talk of slow jamming the news. What does it mean to do that? And I mean, the danger in my method is that people say, oh, it's too fleeting. You're not landing on anything. It's too much of a glancing blow. But I think that the way you've done it in this novel that is surprising is that the long forms, sometimes that can feel to me like it's just a swath of text that's never going to end. But because there's these different modes, I think, and also because of his wife. She brings in, his wife is a scientist. She's a data scientist.
She's a behavioral psychologist.
Behavioral psychologist. Oh, be still my heart. I love these kind of stories. And so she's constantly telling him about human behavior as it's been measured kind of in the lab. And one of my favorite parts in the novel was, which I have to say, you beat me to it because I've always wanted to put this in a book, the famous Milgram study that everybody knows about, I think. And what we took away from it mostly is, given the chance, most people would be like a Nazi and would shock someone. And then in your book, you show all these subtle gradations of actually, well, what if the person said it this way? And what if they didn't have a white coat? And what if they were in proximity? And what if, and this one to me is a very important one, what if one other person in the room who's a Confederate said, no, I don't want to do that?
Yes.
And I feel like often we hear those studies and they have this kind of tidiness to them, some kind of feeling of, now I know something about human nature. But actually, and this I thought was great in the book, there were so many gradations of it. And there was even one more, I think, that I had read about, which is that I think that the people who had done the shocking to the highest degree were very traumatized by it. They were very traumatized when they learned this.
Yes.
And, you can imagine why all these people, these Holocaust survivor people came and did these things. But I wanted to ask you about when you were adding all of these stories that the wife tells.
Yes.
What was the contrast in that was interesting to you?
What happened was many years ago, when was the recession? Maybe 2008 or something. Around that time, I asked colleagues in psychology here whether they would consider teaching a course with me where I would present stories. Cool. And let's say you're reading an Alice Munro story. And we would ask our students to think, how is a certain psychological problem being worked through in the story? Cool. Yeah. In other words, how is the story, in effect, an experiment? And then I would have our colleagues, whoever team taught it with me, present a series of experiments that are famous or popular. And the students would have to show or discuss how they were stories. Does that make sense?
Did it happen? Did you do it?
Well, that's why I asked you, when was the recession? Because we had a new dean and he said, well, this is a difficult time, and that was understandable. And so I never did it. But since then, I had this idea. And I must confess very quickly that I was very struck by, in passing, I read an experiment, which by the way, I've put in the novel, where in an university department, you have in a staff, like where the mail room is or the photocopying is, there was a coffee space and you had to just put in a quarter or whatever, or maybe, pence, because I think it was in Edinburgh. But in any case, someone decided to put a pair of eyes above the coffee pot and immediately the money went up, the contributions went up. So this person then tried to replace the pair of eyes with flowers and the contribution went down. So ever since then, so I'm talking about 10 years, it takes a long time for a book to really percolate down to something. That idea had remained that, I will use that idea of how science is also storytelling. And how storytelling can be scientific or can have a certain rationale or can be an experiment. And I see that my president is listening to me. So, hey, the ideal of liberal arts education.
Well, I felt like I wish I could find the page. I know I marked it, but I feel like one of the best examples of that in the novel is that one of the stories he hears from his wife is about monkeys, monkeys with their baby monkeys. And there's somewhere where the bottom of their cage, correct me if I'm telling this wrong, the bottom of their cage begins being heated. And to an unpleasant degree. And the first thing that the mothers do is they pick up their babies and they hold them to keep them away from the heat. But then as it reaches an incredibly higher level, and I believe in the book, you say that the character hears this on some car talk show or something.
Yes. It's a BBC show called Top Gear.
Okay. So, all right, we'll bracket that for a moment. That's important too. But that when it became truly unbearable, supposedly the mothers put their babies down and stood on them.
Yes.
And this was told as a sort of a hysterically funny anecdote about human nature. But what you did was that you had your character go in and say, did the mothers, like, maybe some of them picked them up and put them down. Maybe some of them like gave, held them close before they did that. And sort of, I think that when people look back on this moment in history, the part where we're still in 2021 being like, it's interesting, these animals, the way they act to animals that they're related to, we're going to call it like affiliative longings. It's sort of like the way we humans have love, like there's still everyone acting like there's none of that. But, that's what I think this making the question complex again.
Yes.
And not being sort of, we think we're only satisfied with sentimental answers that are feel-good answers, but we're also satisfied with really fatalistic answers. Like, that we're all so self-serving ultimately. Both kind have no ambiguity.
Yes. Simplicity is the trap in which not just bad art falls, but also bad science falls.
Mhm.
Everything becomes symmetrical,
Right.
Neat.
Right.
And the idea of fiction is to introduce ambiguity as the real bastion of authenticity. Bastion is a little bit too strong for me right now, but but authenticity, but that moment of doubt,
Mhm.
yeah.
Well, I think that I wanted to get you to talk a little bit more about the sections that are set in India, because
Yes.
as you were mentioning, what we had in the Trump years had been going on, this sort of bowing down to a demagogue that you were talking about that had predated this Trump era.
Yes.
So how did you feel like you could bring the two stories together? You have the story that's taking place, in upstate New York, especially after the pandemic, and has to go home. I felt bad for him when the pandemic was coming on. I was like, you've got to leave your artist retreat. Nightmare.
Oh my God. Jenny, I just had the narrator, reflect on his childhood, and that was one way of going back to India. And because the idea of violence, religious violence, certainly is such a scar for all Indians, I believe, and certainly in my memory, that I wanted to put it in a childhood's. And then I had his wife's relative there as someone who is active on social media to just bring in the current moment into the discourse. But I've never figured it out. In other words, I always feel that the divided parts of my own being are also the divided parts of any narrative I have to write, because I can't have it entirely in India and be entirely local. The Northshire Books will not invite me to do this event. And I can't, I'm just kidding, guys. You guys are the best. And I can't do it just also in America, because then I feel there's so many stories there. I really believe that, So am I answering your question? I'm not.
Yeah, no, I think so. I mean, I feel like, I was kind of aware as I was reading the Indian sections of my own ignorance about the political situation there, and my own, because there's talk of the lynchings, and one of them is a man who is suspected of having eaten beef.
Yeah.
And so the tensions between like factions of the Muslim community and then of the Hindu community, I feel like that, to me, it's interesting you mentioned Claudia Rankine earlier, because I felt like as we're having this really large cultural discussion in America, about how deep the racist roots go and what it means, and lynchings, these words are coming back into the forefront. It was really something to sort of see it happening. It was like a funhouse mirror. Like it was the same sort of othering, as they say in academia, but with different points of reference. Like, it's because you did this, it's because you did that.
Yeah. Isn't it interesting, because you mentioned this, isn't it interesting that that language also travels across continents, that the word lynching, used in a very specific context in this country, gets, in the last 5 years, gets used in India more and more, and just in one context, and I find that very evocative. And you'll remember that I've also, or my narrator has, I don't know whether it was him or me, we cut out from the New York Times a little report. I've put a clipping in the book where the tiger being killed. And I was amazed that the reporter, in describing how the villagers were killing the tiger, I'll show it to people. Here's the clipping. It says, a crowd encircled the tiger in a jungle clearing and hit it in the face. Interesting, the choice, face. As it lay on its back, groaning, the tiger slowly moved its paws in a futile attempt to block the blows. a disturbing video of the incident resembles a lynching. Now, this is entirely, in the Indian context. The reporter for the New York Times, writing from India, is talking really about Muslim men and the videos that circulate, because these people who do these brutal acts are also very much interested in recording it on their phones. And then it goes viral.
Oh.
And I thought that the journalist's way of reframing it was interesting, because folks don't usually try to editorialize in their reports. And it was interesting that this was reframed in that way. And I'm very interested. I try to tell my students, how is it that by supplying a different caption, you reframe things? Also, how by juxtaposing two different images, you juxtapose things? How simply by putting things next to each other in a new setting, you reframe your perception of reality. And so I always think that when we are faced, you and I and our listeners maybe, with this idea of, okay, we have seen folks around us surrender to a fantasy that has been spun by a demagogue, I think, okay, I will reframe it by juxtaposing it with something else. And I always think it's such a little, maybe it's a futile little aesthetic exercise instead of a genuinely transformative one. You know what I'm saying? There's always the sense in my mind that we have to do something much more. Put your body on the line, for example.
Well, I mean, I guess I think that I would argue that maybe there's the whole range of things that need to be done.
Yes,
I mean, there's the part, and it's the part with the most danger and the most glory of putting your body on the line. But what I also find, and in this, I guess I'm thinking a little bit more about some thought I've done on climate. It feels like if people don't have an area that they can work in, that is an area that really is important to them, and they're also comfortable doing, then they won't stay with it. And what we actually sort of need, because there's so many, we saw with the pandemic, if we hadn't seen it before, the idea of being globalized, sort of appeared and was brightly lit in a sinister way. You see that also, I think, with this kind of populism that has taken such a dark shape. How many places is it showing up? So I feel like if it's a many-headed snake, which it seems to be, then there's going to be a lot of different kinds of, I mean, I feel like I shouldn't be talking about killing an animal right after your first image you're doing, but that it's going to take many different ways to deal with the problem. And so I don't know that anything that wrenches something out of received ideas, anything that puts something in a new context, I think allows for a moment of hesitation.
Yes, that's the point.
And whenever we have a moment of hesitation, we are perhaps not going to act completely out of our worst or most frightened impulses. I mean, that's the hope, at least.
Yes. Talking about climate, everyone, please read this book. That's the start. That I loved your use of the word hesitation, because that's very much aligned with my idea that ambiguity or doubt is the proper response sometimes to authoritarian certitudes. Of course, authoritarian certitudes also need to be fought with certainty on various fronts, but also introducing the ambiguity of the sort that writers can do is important to me. In any case, the hesitation that my narrator is interested in particular is in slow jamming the news, right?
Can you talk a bit about the painting that occurred towards the end? Because I feel like that's a very, maybe just give a little context for how that.
Yeah, I was, well, I think Elena is here from Yaddo. I started doing these lunch hour drawings or paintings when I was at Yaddo, just, painting. And where I was trying to just do watercolors of the landscape. But later on, I began drawing things from the news and thinking of changing it. So, for example, there is a picture of this is in color actually, but in its original form, of a man whose name was Muhammad Naeem. He's begging for his life. I just simplified it. It was a picture that everyone in India would have been familiar with when it happened. And I was simplifying it in order to make them see something there. And it was called A Man with Red Marks on His Body. I was basically thinking, and this might seem very simple to people, so I apologize, but I was thinking, if I set myself the task of slowly painting it, I am seeing things in it. I'm slowing down the process for myself. Mm-hmm. And by reflecting on it, by writing words about it, I'm slowing down the consumption of this piece of news by my reader. Mm-hmm. And because it's a quote unquote iconic picture, someone will recognize it right now in the current moment. By slowing it down, I'm altering people's understanding of what is happening in that moment. Mm-hmm. In the same way as instead of in that piece that ends, a man's death being described in his various memories or impulses in those closing moments of his life, slows it down. Mm-hmm. And you're made to enter into a long, well, I'm trying to make his life eternal, actually, also by presenting it on the page and memorializing it in that way, just changing the temporal dimensions of atrocity. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes, absolutely.
And if news, I found that these brutal incidents were happening so fast that I would forget what had happened the previous week. So I was just trying to slow it down that way also.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, if you think of it, just the act of reading versus almost any other kind of thing that you might do, it's hard to sort of skim in book form past things in the same way that you can do online. You can't have all the other windows open that you're looking at. And I feel like I remember reading this article by a science reporter at the beginning, in the midpoint of the pandemic, 9 months in. He was talking about possible ways that things might go. And some of them were like, oh, we'll have a serial sense of kind of solutions, all these different things. But the last one, and I remember feeling like a chill when I read it, and it is, of course, what came to pass, was habituation to horror. And it said, or our urge for normalcy, our desire for this to be over, our need to look away from death will mean that we stop feeling it, and it becomes the way people are about school shootings. It becomes the way people are have been about police brutality. And so I think the idea of using this kind of slow form, because a book is a slow form.
Yes, you can't live tweet.
Technology itself is making you look and stay and not really habituate in the same way that you might if you could flick off your screen. You can close a book, of course.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's quite. I think there's something about the way images, especially in that scene you're talking about the man's like imagining. You have a great line, which maybe this is what was going to be at the very beginning until your editor decided it should go at the end. It said, there's a lot of life
left in a man being killed. Yeah.
It says there's a lot of life left in a man being killed. And then you go into the memories. And so I think there's something there about how images form in our mind that is slower and is allowing that process of looking at this other human being who's suffering and not looking away. So, and I would be very remiss to say that the book is also funny. I really haven't talked about the funny parts because it's a very philosophical and thoughtful book, but there's humor throughout that I think is another way that we all find ways to sort of find something that gets us through the darkest parts.
Jenny, you inspire me in all those respects. I hope I can very publicly and clearly say that. You are so good at that, at being, there being a desire to address things, to look straight into the heart of it, and yet at the same time have now and then this lightness that makes it, the reader is just, you just keep going. And that's something that I find in you. And if I can do that, I'll be a real champion.
Well, I know that we look like we have some great questions.
Okay, cool.
But what a treat to get to talk to you about your book.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm honored.
Thank you both so much. Please type your questions into the chat. Rachel and I will pose them. I've got a question to start off, Amitava.
Yeah.
You spoke a little bit about ambiguity and how that can be a radical thing. Can you expand on that, please?
Yeah. You know, in a police report, a murderer can be represented as someone who, on the corner of 119th Street and Henderson, stabbed a man. But when Chekhov writes about it, you imagine that the murderer takes note of the moon. The murderer perhaps, or the dying man catches a glint of light on the knife. Or, in my case, I'm interested in the murderer hesitating before doing that because there is another memory or another thought. In other words, I'm interested in the role that fiction can play, not only in defying certainties, but in some ways producing a little hesitation in the time machine, to say, what happened or what really happened, and in the narration of things, to produce a certain sense of revision. This happened, but actually, no, this could have happened, or this could, the entry of the subjunctive also, the if. That sort of thing is what I'm thinking of when I'm trying to talk about fiction in those terms.
So I'd love to ask, it seems it would be a shame not to on a night that's co-hosted with Yaddo about a book that is set at a writer's retreat, at least in part. Can you talk a little bit about writers' retreats and what they have meant to you and to your fiction?
Yeah, I was, first of all, Immigrant, Montana, I started writing at Yaddo. And when I came during that stay to your store, I confess that I was seized with a certain, talking about doubt. I had lots of doubts. I thought, will I finish writing the book? Will my book be published? And will it be displayed here at Northshire Books? And to then find the book there when I visited, great satisfaction. I felt, wow, that's great, that's good, that's good. Now I can die, etc., etc. What have I? And so all my past 3-4 books all have been written at, Yaddo has had a great role to play. This one, because of I exploited, even though, in the acknowledgements I mentioned that I wrote it at Yaddo also, I exploited the location of, I had a residency in Bellagio, Italy, and I could look at the mansion of George Clooney and Amal Clooney. So I thought, let me make it picturesque and include those little details. And, every evening they were serving you Aperol spritz. And I thought, let me wax poetic about that and the sight of the lake. One other thing, if I could just say, I don't want to go on and on, but I just thought that putting a part of the narration in a writer's retreat and to show the process of writing is also to, in some ways, demystify writing. That you're not sitting somewhere, it's not like act of inspiration. Instead, you are stealing lines from Jenny and you're overhearing conversations and you're struggling over questions of form. And then you think, oh, I'm reading 1984. Let me insert an essay in the prose as Orwell does. You know what I'm saying? So just to share with readers, turn the reader into a participant rather than a passive observer was what I was thinking.
It also makes the writing life look far more exciting and glamorous than it actually usually is. So that is very exciting about our artist qualities.
There's a question about the pandemic. Should we address that from Susan Fox?
Susan asks, I'm wondering what it was like to write about and during the pandemic.
Yeah, Susan, what happened was that very early during the pandemic, I read that the WHO had said that we were faced with an infodemic that the amount of fake news was also a pandemic of sorts, and that we had to fight against the false information. So my life during the pandemic, I was, of course, with my kids and my wife here and trying to do things like, okay, we had divided our activities in 5 sections, which included painting also every day, the children and I. You might wonder what were the other things. Let me quickly remember. We had to do a few minutes of yoga because, cultural heritage. We had to do painting. We had decided to play outside. Everyone had to write a little bit every day. And lastly, this is a stupid thing to confess, but I had thought I would also become, we would, just before we went to sleep, we would do some planking because my son was interested in building what he calls, his 10 at that time, but was interested in abs. So we thought that, so that was something we were doing in the pandemic, but I was interested during the pandemic. I was interested in continuing what I had started to do with Trump's inauguration, which was noting down a single revealing lie, except it was many more than just a single revealing lie. So I was noting, for example, that an Indian leader had said that drinking cow urine will protect you from COVID, or that smearing your body with cow dung would produce a shield against COVID. So I would note it down. I was very interested. Or other stories, which I've also put in the novel. For example, a mother, one Indian newspaper reported that a mother sent her son out for groceries. He returned with a wife. So I thought everything that was happening in the pandemic had to be carefully written down. So that's what I was doing.
And to think they got it so wrong if they just said that not the cow dung, but a horse dewormer.
Yes, I know. I said something here. So excited for this book, and but you guys go ahead, read it. So that
yes, Aya says, I'm so excited for this book and to see you both discussing how writers can subvert misinformation. Can you say anything about your process of switching from research to writing, and also if the pandemic has challenged that process in any way?
Oh, Jenny has to answer this question first.
Oh no! Well,
no, Jenny, please.
I'm sitting here in shame after hearing your activities during the pandemic. Ours were far less lofty, and they culminated in our house basically becoming like a midden of various layers of abandoned activities, and finally, in a Hail Mary pass, I sent away for something that could turn your dining room table into a ping pong table. That was
beautiful. That was yes. But talk
I
about research.
I wasn't able to write during the pandemic. To be honest, one of the things that amazes me about your book is that you were able to write it in real time. I am somebody that needs to, I don't know what I really feel or think about things as they're happening. Or I psych myself out that it's happening to too many people, and what do I have to say that isn't everyone else isn't experiencing? But I think for me, it was an interesting experiment as a writer in just living and not writing. Because to be honest, no matter what I'm doing, I usually am thinking about writing. I mean, writers are the only people that when they plan a vacation, it's to go away and write.
That's right.
I mean, it's like not a vacation. Also, so I had a sort of, the world opened up a little bit by not writing. But it also made me very edgy and weird not to write.
Yes. But Jenny, please tell Aya also how you turn your wonderful research into these stories. For example, from your from Department of Speculation, which was the first book I read of yours, I found out, if I remember right, how many dogs, was it Jefferson or Washington had? How those little bits of information just produce these little narratives. But also on the question of weather and your research on the climate, please tell I and everyone else, how do you turn your research into writing?
Well, I guess the main thing, my books are so short that people always think that maybe I've written a longer book and cut it down. But really what I've done is I've done a lot of I jot a lot of notes. I think I'm a little bit of a failed scholar that way, that I like to just like take notes forever. And I like to read out as far as I can from something. Like right now, I might be writing a novel that's about what it's going to be like when my only child goes away and goes to college. But I'm reading like conduct books from the 1850s about like people going off to work. And so I go really, really far away. And then this, I actually don't like historical fiction very much to read, but I remember reading once someone who wrote historical fiction saying that the best way to do it is to read all the research and then not look at any of it when you're writing. So what I do is I write it all down, and then I just see kind of what floats back in. And every once in a while, or often, I'm like desperately trying to find something that I've put in there. But mostly I think of it as like that I'm just like gathering things, and I don't yet know how they're all going to be like put together in the nest. So there's a lot of uncertainty.
I like that answer. I like that answer, because I just want to, before any other question comes, I just want to say that if those people who are simply transferring their research into their writing do it, it appears a bit mechanical and research heavy.
Yeah.
And in your case, just your memory recovering something or keeping something intact, and then that coming in, that feels different.
And then I'm
Wonderful.
such like Depression era writer where I want to save every piece of string. So then after I've finished a novel, I'll be like, was there anything there that can move on to the next? I'll be like, oh, I can't do space again. I can't do this again. But sometimes I'll be like, oh, this thing about this 5th century monk, maybe that'll go in the new novel.
It strikes me as very compelling that something that stuck in your memory was, and you could make a case that banana slugs are sexually superior to us. They are hermaphrodites who mate up to 3 times a day.
I mean, yeah, that's a pretty good fact, isn't it? And it's especially when I felt like I was just learning about, like, listening to people talk about, oh, on top of all the other ists that we're also speciesists, and we're also constantly saying, oh, but of course no one makes anything as magnificent as humans. And then you start like reading about the animal kingdom, and you're like, but I can't really travel through the ocean like the whales can, just by singing.
Yeah. Do we have another question, or?
We are actually sadly just about out of time.
Oh, okay. No
this
worries.
has been such a joy and pleasure. I could listen to the two of you talk about your craft all night long, but I'm afraid we have to wrap things up. So
Thank you so
Amitava
much.
and Jenny, thank you both so much for taking the time to be with us tonight.
Thank you to all our friends.
And,
thank you,
Betsy. Please, it's really a wonderful book. And I feel like I just scratched the surface of it with a few questions, but it's really, it was a very compulsive read when I was reading it. You just kind of dive into it and you don't come out till the end.
Thank you, Jenny. I was so afraid when I sent you my first draft, and you were so kind to give me hope. So I appreciate it very much.
Well, thank you all. Thank you for hosting us, and
Thanks.
good night to all of you.
Thank you.
Yes, you can order both books at northshire.com, and you can read about other great events we have coming up there as well. We have another Yaddo Presents event with 2 wonderful poets. So come on back. We'll see you all again soon.
Okay.
Have a great night, everybody. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, Jenny.
Bye-bye.
Bye.